Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. Let's talk about the best recordings of the Sibelius Violin Concerto. I'm in a violin concerto-ish mode right now, and the reason is because I've waited a very long time, as some of you have told me, to actually do these repertoire talks about violin concertos. And the reason is because there aren't many violin concertos, great romantic violin concertos. There's a little handful of them. They sort of start with Beethoven, and then you'd get to like Mendelssohn and Brahms and Tchaikovsky, and as a side, Dvorak, which I've done, and the Bruch, which I haven't done. And that's kind of it. I mean, then you get to the 20th century, and there are a couple more. There's Sibelius, there's Elgar. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny handful, which means that every violinist in the universe has recorded them, often multiple times. And that makes coming up with a best list really kind of complicated because there's just tons and tons and tons of stuff. And I can't possibly cover the entire discography, that is, make a list or talk about them. It would take forever. And the differences from one performance to the next are often quite minute, and you wind up with, I'll make a list, and then you guys will chime in and say, well, you forgot this one, or you haven't mentioned that one. And it's not like I haven't heard them all or don't even own most of them. I mean, I do somewhere, but I want it to be useful. I want it to be helpful. And finally, I just decided, okay, look, either I'm not going to do it at all, or I just have to throw up my hands and say, pick your best ones and go for it. So I'm going for it. And the Sibelius Violin Concerto is one of those pieces. It is a fascinating work. One of the things that makes it so great is that it sounds more like Sibelius than it does like a violin concerto. But it didn't quite get there right away because there is an original version, which has been recorded on BIS as part of the Sibelius Complete Edition, which is a lot more violin-y in terms of its crazy, reckless virtuosity and lengthy passages of kind of pointless violin passage work where the guy just saws and hacks at his instrument forever. I do not like the original version and don't think it's necessary other than to hear once for hardcore Sibelius fanatics. I hope it never becomes a legitimate option in performance. However, I will say this. Sibelius is one of the very few great composers who was also a great violinist. Most great violinists are terrible composers. They write for themselves, and they write violin music, which isn't terribly interesting. But Sibelius was just a great composer whose instrument happened to be the violin. And in fact, he wasn't a very good keyboard player or composer for that instrument at all, which is fabulous because that's what gives his even his orchestral music such a fantastically interesting sound. Of course, the irony of this is that when it comes to things like Sibelius's symphonies, violinists hate his music. They just hate it because it consists almost entirely of like tremolos and ostinato patterns. And when it comes time for somebody to get the tune, he usually would give it to the cellos or the woodwinds. He understands. Not only was he a great violinist, but because he was a great composer, he understood that if you want to do great orchestration, you can't give everything to the violins. You have to feature the winds. You have to do other things. Really, it's a fascinating phenomenon. It really is. The other great composer who was a string player was Dvorak, and he was a great orchestrator for the same reason too, because he understood to avoid the violin when it came to orchestral writing, to make colorful or interesting orchestral writing. Whereas you get keyboard composers, for example, like Brahms, who arguably rely too much on the violins. I just think this is a fascinating topic, maybe for another talk. But the Sibelius Violin Concerto really is an amazing work that sounds totally and characteristically like Sibelius. The most amazing thing about it, and I've played it in concert, I've played timpani and things, it's really hard to do. It's hard for everybody. It's extremely difficult as regards coordination between the solo and the orchestra. And the reason is because it is the most perfect orchestration ever achieved in a violin concerto. Now, I know that sounds dogmatic, but it's really true, especially when you consider that Sibelius uses the full orchestra with, trumpets and trombones and like the whole crew there. And that's astonishing. It's absolutely astonishing. Most composers, when they write violin concertos, make it easy on themselves by reducing the orchestra as much as possible so they won't drown out the soloist. I mean, even like Shostakovich, which is an amazing violin concerto and an incredible orchestration, doesn't use trombones, or trumpets for that matter. Bernstein, when he wrote his serenade, just uses strings, harp, and percussion. It's a very smart move, actually, because violin concertos are very, very difficult to balance. The standard romantic concerto orchestration, for example, Dvorak's or Brahms, leaves out the trombones. Sibelius doesn't. And the reason it's such a great orchestration, the way he achieves everything, is that he keeps the orchestra. There's except for the flutes, there's virtually no point at which the orchestra plays anything above middle C. It's amazing. It's a very dark orchestration. And it's a dark orchestration in the context of the post-Mendelssohnian romantic concerto. That is one that doesn't have a big orchestral introduction or exordium at the beginning while the soloist just sits there like waiting to come in and trying to create a duality in which the orchestra and the solo are equal partners in an ongoing dramatic dialogue and all that stuff that we talk about as classical concerto form, which may or may not make any sense or may not be true. But that's the theory anyway. But no, in this case, in the Mendelssohnian type, the soloist starts right away. You know you're in a concerto, and the orchestra provides the context, the framework, the atmosphere against which the soloist is always pitted. And so the piece has remarkably few orchestral solos. I mean, for the whole orchestra, really very few. I mean, in sonata form terms, they occur during the motion music, during the modulatory passages between the main sections where the main themes are presented. And the most fascinating thing about this concerto is that no matter how much the orchestra gets ripping, and it does, I mean, Sibelius unleashes torrents of sound in between those solos, you always hear the violin. You never have, the end of the first movement, I'll never forget the first time I heard the first movement live. I mean, I was fairly young. It was actually when Diana Jansen was making her, 15 Minutes of Fame tour as a young virtuosa. And she played it in New Haven. And, she's fiddling away like crazy. The orchestra is making this enormous roiling sound like some sort of, horrifying monstrous thing. But it's never fortissimo at that moment when the violin's playing, and it's low. So you hear the violin at all times. In the end of the first movement, she's just going, oomph. And that last oomph, the violin plays with the orchestra. You could hear the violin. You could hear the orchestra. The orchestra sounds loud. The violin sounds loud. It's a miracle of acoustic planning, this concerto. It really is. But it makes it very, very difficult to perform because the orchestra has to be really sensitive to dynamics. And, and there's a lot going on top of whatever the orchestra is doing, which is almost always in long held notes or sort of in a different tempo. It's very, very complicated. And one of the worst performances I ever heard of the Sibelius Violin Concerto was Joshua Bell with Leonard Slatkin in the New York Philharmonic. And I remember it was just awful. And I couldn't figure out why, because he's a marvelous violinist and played it fabulously. And Slatkin is a wonderful conductor and a very sensitive accompanist. But it may have been like the crappy acoustics of Avery Fisher Hall then, but it sounded like the violin was in one work and the orchestra was in another, and there was no point at which they came together. If you're not careful, the two can just detach, and the sound was so off-putting, and it was really, really strange. It just didn't come together. It didn't work. Literally come together. You couldn't hear the violin correctly set in its frame, which is the orchestration. So yeah, it's a tough piece to do, but when it's done well, it is one of the most rewarding and fabulous violin concertos anybody ever wrote. because Sibelius was just a genius string player, and he knew how to write for the instrument. And that was also one of the things, I think, its special quality, its special atmosphere, that prevented it from being popular when it was written. First of all, it was very difficult. And second of all, it was so Sibelian. It sounded so unlike every other violin concerto. Sorry about that little break there. They're vacuuming out in the hallway. I had to wait until they swooped by my door. So anyway, the Sibelius Violin Concerto actually did not become popular until Jascha Heifetz took it up, because he played the bejesus out of it. And that is what brought the concerto to general public notice. And that wasn't until the 1930s or so, in his legendary 78 recording with Thomas Beecham conducting. And so let's start off, shall we, with Heifetz. Now, Heifetz retained his technique, as I discussed before, really until the very end of his life, and he did make a very, very fine stereo recording. It's in this box of great violin concerto box here, which doesn't even mention Sibelius. It says Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Mozart, Tchaikovsky, and more. Well, the more is Sibelius. And he recorded it with the Chicago Symphony under Walter Handel. Now, I have to say, for all that Heifetz is absolutely amazing, and he is, this is not the best performance of the orchestral accompaniment. I mean, Handel is no great shakes. The Chicago Symphony is good. The recording is sonically okay, but there could be much more power and atmosphere in the accompaniment than what Handel brings to the picture. And for that reason, for all the greatness in the violin playing, this is not my favorite recording of the Violin Concerto, or shall I put it in more objective terms, I don't think it's the best recording of the Violin Concerto. It's fabulously well done, and I think you really need to hear Heifetz do it to hear sort of what woke everybody up to the greatness of this music. There's no question that that's there. But the irony of the Romantic Concerto, which features the soloist throughout and not so much the orchestra, is that in this concerto, even though it's of that type, the orchestra is just as important as the solo, or it should be, in producing the right mood and atmosphere of the piece and driving it along. So this is sort of an essential listen, but I think it's been surpassed. I really do. So Heifetz is definitely on the list. Next, talk about somebody who isn't going to stint on the atmosphere. This is sort of a sleeper performance, but it's really good. Bernstein and Zino Francescatti. Francescatti was a wonderful violinist. A lot of you mentioned him in connection with the Beethoven Violin Concerto, for example, his performance with Bruno Walter. He was really a fine, sensitive artist, and his Sibelius is wonderful, and Bernstein is a great Sibelian, and so that's nice to hear. It's here on this horrifying Royal Edition with the terrible watercolors by Prince Charles cover, but you can also get it in the Bernstein Sibelius box or in various other boxy things. And it's definitely worth hearing. It's a fine, fine performance and full of the right kind of mood. That darkness, the gnarly, creepy parts in the first movement, and the uninhibited sort of abandon in that finale, which Tovey called a polonaise for polar bears, which is really rather a stupid thing to do, but, it sounded good and looks good in print. I love that finale. It has that great tune that's like from Ansaga. It almost sounds like da 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 wah, 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 do 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 do. It's amazing. It's just amazing. You can hear the violin no matter what it does because the orchestra is so low in all of the parts. Really kind of astounding. So after Bernstein and Francescatti, I think we should have someone from the home team, don't you? And that's Pekka Kuusisto. Wonderful, wonderful young, I guess he's still more or less young, Finnish violinist. This is with Segerstam and the Helsinki Philharmonic. Gorgeously recorded. A beautiful, ripe, rich, romantic performance, full of the necessary dash and fire. And of course, Segerstam is also never one to stint on atmosphere, and he's got a very strong personality of his own. So you really, really get the meat of it in those first movement interludes and whatnot. Oh, it's just great. So definitely that one on Ondine. It's on Ondine. The Bernstein, of course, is on Sony. and the Heifetz is on RCA. So, I mean, I'm putting these little things up anyway, so you'll see that. Also fantastic and well worth considering was this one, Joshua Bell, who I knew he could do it. See, I knew he could. He just had to be in the right circumstance. This is with the Los Angeles Philharmonic and Esa-Pekka Salonen, who we will hear from again. He is, of course, a wonderful Sibelius atmosphere guy, too, but in a different way, because he's a modern music person, so he likes the angularity of the score and the bite and the sort of its modernisms, if you want to call it that, because it really is a very contemporary piece in some ways. It truly is. It makes sounds. There's sounds in it that no one else has ever attempted in a violin concerto. And Bell is great, and it's got a wonderful coupling, the Goldmark Concerto, which is a rarity. I mean, it always was, and it's a beautiful, lovely work. It really is. It's quite terrific. So this is wonderful. This is on Sony, and it's in the big Esa-Pekka Salonen box. Whether or not you can still find it, like in real life, who knows? It's really a very fine performance, though. So I wanted to mention that, and then this one we also need to talk about. And while we're on the subject of Esa-Pekka Salonen, Hilary Hahn. This is a fantastic performance, too, in the lean and mean and contemporary style. And that style is highlighted by the coupling, which is the Schoenberg Violin Concerto. That's one of the reasons why most people aren't going to buy this, because it's coupled with one of the gnarliest pieces ever written for violin and orchestra. But it's a wonderful work, the Schoenberg Violin Concerto. It can get you in the right moment, and this is an amazing performance of it. I mean, Hilary Hahn understands the music. Esa-Pekka Salonen understands the music, and they project it. And if you just sort of sit back and let it happen, it just may hit you. It happened to me. It happened to me with the Robert Kraft recording, the one on Naxos. It's on Naxos now, anyway. And it was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And this is an equally wonderful performance, but the Sibelius is just dynamite, because you've got two people who just really know what they're doing with the work. And I like the coupling. I think it's fascinating. I really do. So, maybe not the performance for everybody or the album for everybody, but it's awfully terrific. And one of the few wonderful major new things that Hilary Hahn got to do after she decamped to Deutsche Grammophon. Of course, sales of this probably, led to them wanting her to do much less. But wow, what a disc. It's an amazing disc. Now we have to talk about another wonderful Sibelian, Ormandy. Now here's the Ormandy Sibelius box. Ormandy did the Sibelius Concerto at least 3 times, maybe more. I'm not talking about mono stuff. I don't remember what's in the mono box. But he did it with Isaac Stern, which is in here, and which is excellent. Everybody likes to crap on Isaac Stern because he wasn't Heifetz or wasn't this or wasn't that. He's a really good violinist, and he's really fine in the Sibelius Concerto. He plays it wonderfully, and he also did it with Oistrakh, which is not in here criminally. I don't understand why not, because the Ormandy Oistrakh is definitely one of the great performances of the work. It's beautiful. Now, all of these, the Stern, the Oistrakh, and Diana Jansen in here, who is, not the most interesting of the 3, but it's still very good. But I mean, Stern is much better, and Oistrakh is much better, and I don't necessarily find Stern inferior to Oistrakh in this work. At least as recorded here. The fact of the matter is, let's talk tachlis here. The fact of the matter is that they all play the music in what you might call the romantic Russian vein. And I like the romantic Russian vein. It's romantic and it's Russian. I mean, there's nothing not to like. It is as different as possible from Hilary Hahn or even Josh Bell with Salonen over here, because Salonen is in both of those. It's quite different. You can do a lot with this concerto. There could be very, very different approaches, and throbbing emotionality is but one of several approaches, because the piece, just listen to the opening, with that tremolo, that frosty tremolo, and the violin coming with the ya-da-da, ya-da-da-da-da, ya-da-da-da-da-da. Anyway, I mean, there's something so lonely and so desolate and, like I said, sort of alienated about it. It's also quite contemporary. So you can do it either way. But in the old romantic style, which is just lovely, this is a wonderful, wonderful performance. It really is first class. I mean, the Stern and the Oistrakh, which isn't in here, they're worth having. So you should consider them both, because Ormandy, of course, is one of the great concerto accompanists, and it's beautiful to hear the wonderful, lush framework that he creates for his soloists. Also marvelous is Colin Davis with Salvatore Accardo. There's another violinist we don't hear much about anymore. Accardo was another extremely sensitive, very, very fine artist. He did all the Paganini concerti. He really was quite a virtuoso, but in an unassuming kind of way. I think that makes him very good for the Sibelius concerto, because the virtuosity is there, but it doesn't ever sort of, overwhelm these Sibelianisms. And Colin Davis is, of course, an amazing Sibelian, a fabulous Sibelius conductor. This is with the London Symphony, and it's exceptionally fine. So that's worth considering, too. It's on Decca. The Ormandy stuff is all on RCA now, or Sony or something. Well, in that box is RCA, but it was Sony originally. And then, this one is fun. This one is a lot of fun, and it's a remakes a very fine coupling about which we will discuss momentarily. The Nielsen and Sibelius violin concertos with Maxim Vengerov, the Chicago Symphony, and Barenboim. Vengerov is just a dynamite violinist, and he plays it superbly well. Barenboim has no cachet in Sibelius or Nielsen, but he knows how to accompany well enough. He really does. You might call this the Wagnerian version, but it's not really. I'm just kidding. The Nielsen concerto is a logical coupling because they're both Scandinavian and whatnot, but nobody really likes the Nielsen violin concerto. I do, but the problem with the Nielsen concerto is that the finale is a huge letdown if you expect a virtuoso finale. The Nielsen concerto is one of those pieces that follows an emotional trajectory that has nothing to do with the fact that it's a violin concerto. Nothing at all. It starts out fiery and passionate and then ends up light and amiable. And you don't want light and amiable in the finale of a violin concerto. Usually you want like insane. It's got to be even more bravura than the first movement is. And that's not what happens. So the Nielsen violin concerto gets a lot of crap handed to it. And Nielsen also was a violinist. That's what's also fascinating about it. He writes this deliberately unshowy, unvirtuoso violin concerto. And he's another composer whose violin parts drive orchestral players crazy because he gives all the fun stuff to the woodwinds. It's really, we really need to talk about this at some point. It's such an interesting phenomenon. But the Vengerov is beautifully done. And, it's on this Warner Apex sort of budgie thing. I don't know if it's still out there, but it was. I mean, it's definitely in the Vengerov box, which I have sitting over there under the television. So, you might want to consider that too. But now we're down to our final three. And these final three are sort of my faves. And they have been for a long time. And I listened to them, again, to prepare for this little video. And I see no cause at this point to change my mind for the ones that just thrill me unutterably. First, Iida Handel and Paavo Berglund. Berglund. It's Berglund and Sibelius, which is always great. And he's also like Esa-Pekka Salonen. He's also a Sibelian who is on the more modernist, cooler side of things as often as not, which I just think works so well in this concerto. I really, really do. And then you've got the Bournemouth Symphony, which was playing wonderfully in Sibelius, and it's on EMI, and it's a classic version. And I also think it's important to give some props to Iida Handel, who was one of the 20th century's great violinists, and who never really had the recording career that she deserved. She had a huge repertoire and all kinds of interesting stuff, and she was a wonderfully thoughtful artist. But she just, maybe because she was a woman or for whatever reason, she didn't look great in a dress. I don't know. She didn't get the acclaim that I think her artistry deserved. And this was one of her showpiece works. She recorded it. There's one on Supraphone. She played the Sibelius everywhere. It was one of her standout pieces, and she just was fabulous in the Sibelius. So I think she deserves to be heard doing it, and she does it in the best possible way. This was one of those thank God that she had the opportunity to do it with Berglund at this time. It's an amazing performance. Another one, again with Esa-Pekka Salonen, his third. But this was, I think, his first recording of the Violin Concerto, actually. But this is the third one we're talking about. Cho Lang Lin with oh, this is so splendid. My goodness, this is with the Nielsen, too. And this was the performance that sort of put the Nielsen on the map, since to the extent that it's on the map at all. This is a great coupling. It's been universally regarded as such. I don't think anybody's ever had a negative word to say about this disc, at least that I've seen. Of course, somebody will. I mean, it's classical music. Someone's got to hate it. But, this is really, really fine. And I think this was the performance of the Sibelius that really showed what a modern and fascinating work it really can sound like when you've got a conductor who's into that aspect of the music. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It's with the Philharmonia for the Sibelius and the Swedish Radio Symphony for the Nielsen, and it was recorded in 1987 for the Nielsen in 1988. Really a fantastic disc, and I'm so glad it's still around. It was also reissued in one of those like brown paper bag newsprint great recordings of the century, or I don't know, whatever it was called, great performances, I think. In that series, it also was available, but I've had this since it came out on CD. And this is the one since 1987. It's like a vintage CD, and it still plays. I mean, it was nicely pressed. It looks fine. I'm very excited that it still functions. It's really a dynamite performance. And again, a violinist who doesn't always get the props that some other big name violinists have gotten. I mean, you'll notice there's no Perlman in this set for good reason. There's no sort of the hot name people. A lot of them didn't do the Sibelius. A lot of the former big names besides Heifetz didn't even play the work. It's very interesting. It's a special piece. It deserves a special place in the pantheon of violin concertos. Finally, last but not least, however, the one that I think really just knocks it out of the park. Well, I mean, a bunch of these do. You're good with any of them. You really are. But this is a sort of a personal favorite. Victoria Mullova. Ooh. Now, when she started making records, she made just a handful of records for Philips and then went to her own label and, started doing other strange things. But this was Sibelius and Tchaikovsky violin concertos. I just love the way she plays this piece, because it seems to me that with Ozawa particularly, they combine that sort of like the modernist aspect I like with the throbbing Russian thing, because this is a very dark performance. She has a very full, dusky sort of violin tone that I think suits the piece fantastically well. And she plays with great rhythmic firmness and deliberation. It's not frantic. The virtuosity is there to burn. But there's this seriousness of intent that I think gives the piece a wonderful emotional depth that a lot of performances don't attempt. I mean, the ones that I have mentioned, they do attempt it. Let's be clear, everybody understands in this batch what's going on in the music. But this is just such a super realization, and it's stunningly well recorded. And the Tchaikovsky's great, too. We're going to have to, you'll see this again when we do the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. But boy, this is a knockout for the Sibelius Violin Concerto. It just blows me away, especially the finale, which is, it just sort of bump, it can sound a little bit light and facile, I think is the word, but not here. This is all of a piece. It's one giant, threatening, passionate, fantastically expressive organism, start to finish. And I like my organisms that way, and I hope you like your organisms that way. So, Victoria Molova, Seiji Ozawa, now on Decca, formerly on Philips. It's just an amazing thing. So there are a dozen or so great Sibelius violin concertos to get your pulse racing. Get out there and keep on listening. Thank you for joining me. Take care.